Good evening. So part of my job is to give talks. So this is the first of several talks that we're going to do here at the cathedral over the summer. Most of the time what happens during summer is people kind of leave, they go on vacation, they're here from time to time, and what happens is you end up getting like a really kind of dead church, by which I mean there's not as many people consistently here because in June and July and August people are, taking time off. Myself, in about 3 weeks, I have a son who will be born in about 3 weeks. So pray for me if you can manage it, because we already have three. So we have 3 little boys, and then there's another little boy on the way, and the house is absolute chaos. So pray for me because I'll need the patience. But this series of talks, so this one will be done by myself. The next one will be done by Mr. Joseph Green, who is our coordinator of music and our organist, who you just heard. And then the last one will be done by Father Partida. And then hopefully we'll have an opportunity, if more people start showing up, then we'll be able to have some more of these talks. The talk tonight is going to be on Catholic tradition. And the reason that I thought it was important to talk or open the series of lectures on Catholic tradition is because a lot of times you kind of misunderstand them. Why? Because there's so many. And so a lot of times there's an opportunity for confusion. You come to Mass on Sunday and you see maybe incense rising and you're like, I have no idea what that means, right? Or you see that there's maybe 6 candles instead of 4 candles and you think to yourself, I have no idea what any of that means. So there's a tendency to misunderstand the role of tradition or how tradition functions in the Catholic life. So this is the question overall in the next maybe 45 minutes that I want to try to answer. And that question is, how does God use Catholic tradition to draw us to himself specifically in the liturgy, specifically when you're going to Mass? So I'd like to start with 2 stories of misunderstanding a tradition to kind of that may be helpful for you in starting to think about this. The first is that one of the things that I do as my job as the associate for the Office of Divine Worship is I'm pretty much second in command for the office, the diocesan office, that works on how Masses are done in the diocese. So you got to think from here to maybe Blythe, all the way to Pomona, maybe to Oceanside. We have churches all over the place. So my job is to make sure that these Masses are happening the way that they're supposed to, right? According to the Catholic tradition. That's one of the things that I do. So it's very important that people, especially here at the cathedral, see me walking in with my 3 sons from time to time, so that they can see liturgy isn't always pretty, right? Sometimes you're going to Mass and a toddler is going to scream. And just as an example, this happened during Lent. So here I am, people are starting to know me as the associate director of the Office of Divine Worship, right? And here I am coming, I'm maybe a couple rows back there. And we're at the part of the Mass where the priest is reading the intercessions, right? And the response to the intercessions is, Lord, hear our prayer, right? Everybody knows this. You stand up, and sometimes you pay attention, sometimes you don't, if you're lucky. And you repeat, Lord, hear our prayer, Lord, hear our prayer, Lord, hear our prayer. Well, so my 2-year-old, his name is Rafa. My 2-year-old is the kid that God gave me to let me know that I'm not really in control of anything. Some of you are laughing because you have kids like this. So Rafa, I'm standing there and I'm looking right here. Father Raphael is, reading the intercessions. Lord, hear our prayer, Lord, hear our prayer. And Rafa says, Daddy, my butt hurts. Okay. But I don't look at him, right? He's sitting right next to me. There's no screams, there's no nothing, so I just keep looking. He says, Daddy, my butt hurts. I go, I know, Rafa, I'm going to get to you in a second, right? Thinking maybe he has to go to the bathroom. Daddy, my butt hurts. And then behind me, I hear 2 older ladies just cackling, not like polite laughs like you would do during Mass if something was funny, just cackling, they've lost it. So I turn around, and they're looking at my son, Raphael, who's taken his pants down all the way around his ankles, and he says, Daddy, right here, but this is where my butt hurts. By that point, everybody in the church, like the back half of the church is just cackling. And this is like maybe the second week of Lent where you're supposed to be, serious. Okay, my son, Raphael, is not old enough to be invested in a tradition, okay? He's not old enough to be invested in a tradition. And that's the role of tradition, right? It's a kind of school for how you should act. And without those traditions, we have a tendency to kind of waver or we kind of have a tendency maybe to act unjustly, act incorrectly, maybe even cruelly when we're not formed in the same tradition as our neighbor. So tradition is this kind of unifying thing that's really important in the Catholic faith. Let me give you another example of a misunderstood tradition that is maybe a little bit heavier. So in medieval Greece, there was a monastery, I think it was Mount Athos, for those of you who are familiar, somebody on the internet. We're live streaming, so somebody on the internet will probably fact check me. But believe it was Mount Athos. So they had this tradition where at the liturgy, at every mass, so the main priest, right, the higher monk would be celebrating the liturgy, and it came to the part where the priest had consecrated the Eucharist. So now Jesus is there present. And as Jesus is there present, they had a tradition where every time they consecrated the Eucharist and they would start incensing the altar, the priest would walk over to a column, much like you can see over here. He would just walk over to a column and he would start incensing the column. Right? What a strange thing to do. If you saw Father Raphael here, and after he consecrated the Eucharist, he came down and just went to the column and didn't say anything. And they did this for hundreds and hundreds of years. Nobody had any idea why they kept incensing the column. What a strange thing to do, right? There's no signs, there's no symbols on this column. It's just a column. And so for years and years, they did this over and over and over again until one of the young monks asked, "Why, Father, do we do that?" And the older monk said, "I don't know. It's been handed on to us. I have no idea. We just do it because our fathers did it, and so your fathers will do it, and then when your fathers, you will do it, right?" Well, a couple months later, there was an earthquake, and it damaged the entire back half of the church, the most important of which seemed to be that column. And as that column was destroyed, they went to dig the column out because they had to put a new one in, and they found in a stone box the relics of St. John the Baptist, right? The cousin of Jesus, the last of the prophets. There were his bones underneath that column. And they had no idea. Over and over again, they would just go to the column and they would incense it, have no idea why. So even in the moments that they had forgotten, they had retained the tradition, and the tradition was a binder to their past, was a binder to the saint who they didn't even know was interceding for them. Okay, so this is tradition. And the idea here is God is going to use these ancient traditions, these signs and symbols, sometimes that we don't even know what they mean, to remind us that he has healed us, that he's revealed himself to us, to our fathers, and that at every liturgy he does it over and over and over again. He newly reveals himself to us. He newly heals us. So we might start with this question, well, what is liturgy? We won't go yet, Joseph. Joseph's going to be my Vanna White because I don't have a clicker. Our clicker broke, so I have to yell at him from the choir loft here. So you might answer this question like this. If you're going to answer this question, what is a liturgy, right? You come to a liturgy every Sunday, you know that you're supposed to be here, you're supposed to be at a liturgy. Some liturgy, whether it's the Spanish Mass, the English Mass, whatever the case is, okay? What is it that you're attending? And to answer that question, it requires that we have a really short review of what we call Catholic salvation history, or the notion of this question. How is it that I'm saved? What does it mean that I'm saved? Because if I ask anybody in here, okay, why did Jesus need to become man? Or why did Jesus die on the cross? You might say something like, to forgive us of our sins. Okay, but do you know what that means? If I asked any more questions, would you be able to articulate to me what exactly it means that Jesus becomes like me to save me? Joseph, if you could be so kind. Okay, so this is where we have to start. We have to start in this book of Genesis, right? Now, if I tell you, okay, let's start in the book of Genesis. What's the principal story from Genesis? Everybody here will almost immediately go to Adam and Eve, right? This is the story that everybody knows from Genesis. There's 54 chapters, but the first really 3 are the ones that are kind of seared into our brains. And if I ask you what happened, you might say, God placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. He placed them there. He gave them one rule: you can't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They did it. A snake tricked them, and now humanity is fallen, broken, whatever word you might use. Okay, is that wrong? No. But if you do that, if your mind goes immediately there and you don't read the text, there's a tendency to lose the richness of what it is that God is communicating. Joseph, if you could be so kind. So here's the distinction. When the book of Genesis was written, and we know roundabout when it was written in contrast, or it was written around the time when the Jews were still enslaved by Babylon, by the Babylonians. And so they were writing a book to distinguish themselves. What do we know about our God? How has our God come to meet us? And so they begin to write, Moses begins to write, begins to write the book of Genesis. to distinguish himself from that Babylonian story. So I'm going to give you this Babylonian story in just cliff notes. This is what the Babylonians believed about how the world began. So you have two main gods. There's a male god and a female god, and their names are Apsu and Tiamat, and they are the original gods. They're the creator of things. They just exist. We don't know how they exist, but they just do. And they have a whole bunch of children who they find very, very annoying. Okay? Now, Apsu, who is the male god, decides, you know what? Let's take a mulligan. I'm going to kill all these kids. We'll try again later, right? So that's his intention, is to kill all of these, and we're talking about like other children gods. And he decides, nope, I don't want anything to do with them. They're very annoying. I'm going to kill them, okay? Now, they find out about this, and before he has an opportunity to kill them, they kill him. So they all band together and they kill their father. Mom, Tiamat, who is enraged at the death of her husband, decides, I'm going to take these kids out one by one. And she fills the earth with demons and awful monsters who roam the world, trying to kill these children one by one by one. Now, these children are so afraid that they get their oldest brother, his name is Marduk, the god Marduk, to go and kill Tiamat. And he does, in an awful, violent way, right? But what he does is, at the death of his mother, Tiamat, he takes her body and rips it in half. And all of the entrails that come out become all of the lands of the earth. And with the bottom half, he continues to fashion the earth. And then with the top half, he creates the heavens where the gods will live. They're not winning any awards, this family. Okay? That's the point here. They're not winning any awards because the creation of the universe here is something that is violent. It's bloody. It's something that demands tribute. And so what is the role of a human being in Babylon? Right? If that's your gods, if those are the gods that you worship, what is your role as a human being? You have no role except to serve these gods who you cannot call good, who you cannot call holy, who you cannot say have any interest in you other than their own affairs. So Moses is writing the first chapters of Genesis, of the book of Genesis. And he writes this. Joseph. Oh, good. He writes this. In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was formless. Void and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning the first day. Next slide, Joseph. So there are a couple things that you'll notice almost immediately in the contrast to the Babylonian, right, the war myth, versus what Moses is writing here. Joseph, if you could give me like 2 clicks. Actually, give me 3 clicks. Perfect. So the first is that God never struggles. Think of the god Marduk tearing his mother apart, right? The act of sheer violence that it takes, the sheer anger that it takes to create the universe. That's not what we have here. God doesn't struggle. He never struggles. He says very gently, "Let there be light," and the universe obeys. It obeys, right? Think about the way Jesus casts out demons, right? If you read the Gospels, one of the things that you'll notice is that Jesus never we don't have any accounts of Jesus raising his voice, right? So you watch The Exorcist or something and you'll see the priest like, "The power of Christ compels you," and it's very loud and very dramatic because it's a horror movie. Jesus never does that. He does the same thing that he does at the creation of the universe. He says it, and it happens. There's no struggle, there's no effort on his part, right? He's infinite, almighty, all-knowing. He says, "Let there be light," and there is light. The second thing that you'll notice is that we have a creation, what the fathers call ex nihilo. That means from nothing. So if you go back to the Babylonians, where does the earth come from? Yeah, from the mother, right? From the entrails, the intestines of the mother that are scattered across the earth, right? So even those gods, they need something to work with. They need something to start with. God doesn't need something to start with. He just says, and it is, right? He just says, and it is. This is the way that he creates. Not just things, but us. This is the way that he creates in gentleness. He calls you into existence very gently, very softly, okay? And the last thing here, oh good. So the first thing that happens is after he creates, God looks at the thing that he's created, right? So he sees that there is night and there's day, and he says, it is what? Good. Imagine that. God says it is good. You say that when you delight in something. So here's the three things that we know. God doesn't struggle. He just says it and it happens. God doesn't need other materials that are equal to him so that he can start fashioning things. No. He says it and it comes from nothing. And when he creates something, he delights in it. Parents, those of you guys that are parents here, right? Think about delighting, right? That kind of sigh that, Think about your husband or your wife, right? Maybe the first time you went on a date and you had your first kiss, and you finally separate, you get back to your apartment and right? That sigh of relief, that delight in the goodness of what's just happened. That is the way that God creates. Okay, so then God does something even crazier, even more unexpected for the Babylonians. Remember, because Moses, he won and does something that no other God would have ever done in the ancient times. It says this, then God said, let us make humankind in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon earth. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. God said, see, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps upon the earth, everything that has breath of life, I've given every green plant for food. And it was so. Why? Just because God said it. God saw everything that he made, and indeed, it was very what? Good. It was very good. So he creates and delights. Okay, Joseph, if you could, 2 more. So I want to make this distinction here, okay? So this is St. Augustine. This is a picture of St. Augustine, one of my favorite saints. And he makes this distinction, because when you read this, you go, what does it mean that man is in God's image? Does it mean that we look like him? Well, it can't be that. It can't be that, because God doesn't have a face, right? God is beyond time and space. He's outside of existence. He doesn't have like a mouth. He doesn't have hands in the way that we think about it. So does it mean, when Scripture says, I'm made in the image of God, does it mean that I look like him? No. Image, St. Augustine says, refers to man's ability to know and to love rationally. To know and to love rationally. This is distinct. This is what makes us specifically human. You might say, can a dog know things? Of course, he knows where you put the bowl. But does he know things rationally? No. He can't know things rationally. I'd be crazy if I took my taxes, in January to my dog and said, hey, can you figure this out with me? No. That'd be crazy, right? Okay, so to know rationally, to choose rationally, okay. Now, the other part of that is to love rationally. You say, can a dog know? Can animals know? Yes. Can they love? Yes. But can they love rationally? Meaning according to laws that are binding, according to the nature of the thing. Let me give you an example. In 3 weeks, around 3 weeks, I will have a brand newborn son. And that baby is going to cry and cry and cry at 2 o'clock in the morning, then probably 2:30, then about 3:30, then maybe it'll give me a break at 4:30. Now when I hold that baby and I pick him up, right? When I hold that baby, does my heart swell and I go, oh my God, I just love, as this baby's screaming in my ear, do I go, oh, I just love this baby so much? No. I want him to go to sleep. But do I love him despite my feelings? Do I love him over and above my feelings? See, I love rationally. I love according to what he is. Similarly, if one of my other sons said, hey, I'm hungry, right? And so we have a dog at home, his name is Angus. If my son said, hey, I'm hungry, and I said, yeah, I'm going to make you mac and cheese, and then I put a bowl on the ground right next to the dog bowl, and I filled it with mac and cheese, I said, go ahead, eat. And I made my son eat mac and cheese out of a dog bowl. No, that love doesn't match what he is. I have to love him rationally according to what he is. So this is what Genesis means when it says man is made in God's image. That God knows infinitely, and God loves infinitely, without end, without limit. So I can know and love like him. That's what it means to be in man's image. Now, St. Augustine says, okay, so we know what it means to be an image. But what does it mean to be in the likeness? Okay. The likeness is that divine grace. It's the gift, it's God's charitable gift of himself that perfects the image. In other words, Adam and Eve, you ever been hangry? Right? Where you just needed something to eat and somebody said, maybe your spouse said something to you and you just, well, hold on, wait a minute, right? If you've ever done that, that would be irrational, right? You need to sit down and eat a sandwich. Okay, Adam and Eve don't experience that. Why? Because the image is perfected by that likeness. It's God's gift of himself that seals and binds and makes it perfect. It's a gift of union with himself. In other words, it can be taken away. But it's God's gift to give it to Adam and Eve, to be in the likeness. Right? They're never tempted to disrespect one another. Or if you've ever walked into a room and said to yourself, what did I walk in this room for? Their memories don't work like that. They know exactly what they're doing at all times. But they're also, because of that likeness, because of that gift of God's grace, of himself, they're also perfectly charitable. Right? This is why Genesis gives us one of the details. They were naked and felt no shame. In other words, there was nothing to hide from one another. They could trust in each other's likeness, that God had binded and sealed all of those possible imperfections. They didn't have them because they were unified to the Lord. Okay. Joseph, if you go to the next point here. So, all of this is to say, Adam and Eve know God by the signs and symbols that are present in the Garden of Eden. In other words, they can look at the trees, the water, the food that they have, and they know God's infinite goodness just by the fact of what's there in front of them. These signs and symbols are easy for them to recognize, and they know that the Lord is near, not just because they hear his voice in the Garden of Eden, but specifically because that likeness makes them aware, like precisely aware of where God is. They don't have to guess, they know. They know the depths of God's presence even in their own souls. They feel it, they know it, right? That's the gift of that likeness. And in Catholic terminology, one of the things we call that is sanctifying grace. Sanctifying grace. It's the gift of that likeness that binds and seals and perfects and makes good and perfect that ability that we have to know and to love. Compare that to Babylon. What is a human being for in Babylon? If the gods you worship rip each other apart for the simple fact of being annoying, what is your role in Babylon? What does it mean to be a human being? It's not very fun. All you exist for is serving. But here, we have something radically different. What does it mean to be a human being in the Garden of Eden? It's to be loved, to be gently called into existence, to be known and to be loved. That the God of the universe, who's beyond space and time, delights just in the fact of your existence. Just because you exist, he delights, he breathes, just like after a first kiss. The very fact of looking at you is enough for God to, Adam and Eve, their role, this is what the fathers say, the fathers of the church say, their role is to be what we call theologians. Their role is to be theologians. And a theologian, according to the fathers, is someone who sees God face to face. In other words, they speak to God. They know God. They know his movements in and around their life. They thank God. And all of this doesn't come from the fact of reading books, but it comes from a deep and abiding prayer life. To know God, to know his nearness just by the signs and symbols of life. Okay, so Joseph, if you could go to the next slide, please. So we might ask this question like this. Which one of these is a theologian? So on the left side, you have, does anybody know who that is on the left side? That's Bishop Rojas, right? So this is his cathedral, right? Okay, so I asked this question. Who is the theologian? Bishop Rojas? Or the old lady who's here for, at 7 o'clock in the morning, maybe she's a little cranky, clacking her rosary beads right before Mass starts. Which one is the theologian? I'm asking. Okay, so someone would say all of us? That's a very nice answer. Okay, good. Yeah, good. Any other, raise your hand if you think it's the old lady clacking her rosary beads, right? Maybe she's a little cranky, but okay, good. Raise your hand if you think it's Bishop Rojas. He'll be very disappointed that not all of you raised your hand. No. The answer is, it depends. Right? Bishop Rojas can come up here and celebrate a Mass, and he literally can change bread into God. But what if he came here and he rushed? What if he's thinking about 100 other things? Is he being a theologian then? Is he seeing God face to face? Is he patiently waiting? No. Is he doing the Mass? Yes. Does God honor that? Yes. But is Bishop Rojas a theologian? No, not in that moment. What about the old lady, right? You might say, yeah, she's a little cranky. But who does she depend on? Who does she get up in the morning for? I don't get up at 7 in the morning. I'm not here at 7 in the morning. But that old lady here, every morning at 7, those rosary beads clacking. She's a theologian, right? So long as she tries to see the Lord, so long as she tries to notice where he is in her life, so long as she depends on him, she's a theologian, and maybe even more of a theologian than Bishop Rojas might be at any given time. Does this make sense? This is what distinguishes Adam and Eve, right? They are theologians in the proper sense. They see God face to face, and that is a gift of their likeness, that sanctifying grace that binds and makes them good, okay? So, by that likeness, because they have that likeness, they can know him just by the created order, by the trees, by the food, right? Joseph, you could go to the next slide. That's perfect. So we all know that they eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, right? They make a mistake. Here's why that's bad. Because they lose the likeness, but the image remains. So here you have this beautiful picture of St. Nicholas. Some of you might be familiar with St. Nicholas. Santa Claus, if you will. And on the left-hand side, you have this very beautiful image by Giovanni Gasparo, right? Who's this beautiful, rich colors. Now, what do you notice about the picture on the right? Yeah, it's faded. Yeah. Do you see that the image is still the same on the right? It's the exact same image, but it's faded. It's ripped. It's torn. The image has remained, but its perfection, right? Its likeness is gone. The image has remained, but the likeness, its perfection, is gone. Now, what does that mean for liturgy, right? Because we're trying to answer this question about, okay, so what does that mean when I come to Sunday Mass? Here's why that's important. Remember that one of the things that the likeness does, that sanctifying grace does, is it allows you to notice by sign and symbol that God has come to meet you, that God is present to you in any given moment. The loss of that likeness means that I start looking for other things besides God. And because I've done that, maybe I lose my sensitivity. Not maybe, I do lose my sensitivity to recognize him when he comes to meet me. Because the reality is that each one of us in here is a body and soul composite, right? Sometimes you have this idea of like, well, where's my soul? Maybe it's inside me like a Tom and Jerry cartoon. You ever seen Tom and Jerry and, the cat dies and then, like a spirit floats out of him and he takes a stairway to heaven, right? Okay, you guys know what I'm talking about. A lot of times we think of our souls that way. We think of, I'm a soul that's trapped in a body. No. You are a body and a soul. You are both. What it means to be a human is to be a body and soul. That means the things that I know have to come through physical senses. But if I've lost my sensitivity, if I've lost the likeness, then how do I recognize the spiritual realities that they contain? That's the problem. The principal way that Adam and Eve, and so we as their children, are affected is that because we lose that likeness, we lose our sensitivity to being theologians. We lose our ability to recognize that God is near, and so to see him face to face. Okay, so what does God do about it, Joseph? So God, who refuses to let his children be lost, takes on our human misery and offers himself on a cross. Why? Why a cross? Because I am a body and soul composite, I'm made of both. Someone asked St. Augustine, this is one of my favorite quotes of all time. Someone asked St. Augustine, why did God have to die on a cross? Couldn't he have just snapped his fingers? Right? Couldn't he have just said from heaven, you're all forgiven, and that's it? And his response, I have it here. God could have saved us in 100 ways that would have been comfortable for your stupidity. In other words, you're not thinking. Why does God decide? Why does God offer himself on a cross? God saves me by what is tangible. Right? If somebody said, 100 years ago, do you know that you're saved? Okay. But if someone says, look at wood, look at the nails, look at the blood, look at the anguish on his face, now we're talking about something different. We're talking about a different kind of recognition, right? If somebody says, you hurt my feelings, okay, I can comprehend that, yeah. But when you see somebody cry because of something genuinely cruel that you've done, it affects us. The sign gives us something about the intangible. So we're asking, why does God have to die on a cross? Well, he doesn't in the strict sense. He could really have said from heaven, all right, you're all good. Let's try again. He could have done that. But he chose the signs and symbols that would let me recognize the cost and the weight, the depth of that love. To say that there's something so important about you and myself in God's eyes that he would rather be crucified than the possibility of spending an eternity without us. And that doesn't just happen by the snap of his fingers, by the boom of a voice, but by a nail driven through a hand, by a physical reminder. Because I need it. Because the only way I know things is by my senses. Okay? So God saves me by tangible things, by things I can understand, by wood, by metal, by nails, by blood, by ripped tunics, by dirty open wounds, by death and resurrection. My likeness is restored. This is what you give in baptism to a child. Their likeness, that gift of God's self that binds and heals all the possible imperfections in my nature. That's what God gives to us in baptism, but he doesn't stop there. In every liturgy, now we're back at liturgy, every time you come to Mass, the Lord gives you his body and blood. And not just his body and blood under the veil of what looks like bread and wine, but behind incense, behind cloth, behind stone, behind wood, is the Lord present to you. So he doesn't just give you back that divine grace. He doesn't give you back the likeness, that sanctifying grace in baptism. He increases it every time you receive communion. It's an increase. And there's no limit to that increase because God is generous. He doesn't say, okay, you've had enough sanctifying grace. No. Every time you come to Mass, there's an increase in that likeness. There's an increase in the way that God desires to perfect you. There's an increase in the way that God desires to heal you. You only need to see him behind the signs and the symbols. That's the point here. Every time I receive the Lord in what appears to me as bread and wine, he gives me a greater increase in that likeness. And the more divine I am, in other words, the more that I receive, the more I say, yes, Lord, thank you. The more that I hunger for that likeness, the more that I desire to receive him, the greater increase there is, the more holy I am. The more I can delight in the smell of incense. You might like the smell of incense, you might not like it, but do you see him is the question. Do you see him taking your prayers to the Father, right? Do you see him in that veil? See, Mass is an opportunity for the Lord to part the curtain, right? To say, you can't see me. It's impossible for you to see me. to contain in just your eyes everything that I am, to contain in your ears everything that I am. So he gives us something we can recognize, something that's easy. That's the signs and symbols. That's the liturgy. That's the tradition. Okay? So, we're asking this question. What is liturgy? That's this question we started this part off with. What is a liturgy? What are you coming to on Sunday? It's an invitation by God to restore me to what I've lost by my sin, by the sins I commit day in and day out. It's a restoration. Every time I receive, God restores me. Okay? Okay. But why do we have these specific signs and symbols? Why incense? Why these colors? Why stone this way? Why is the altar looking this way? Why is the church built this way? Why are the rafters, why are they this way? Well, let's talk about tradition. It's common to think of traditions as like little customs that never really extend further than whatever it is that you're doing. So an example would be something like this. My son last year, so for the first time he saw a Charlie Brown Thanksgiving. Right? Some of you guys might be familiar with it. The Charlie Brown Thanksgiving. And very famously, Snoopy is in charge of cooking Thanksgiving dinner. And everybody's on their way over. And so he cooks like pieces of toast, he cooks a bowl of popcorn, he fills a bowl with jelly beans, and that's what's served at the table. And so Peppermint Patty gets there and she says, where the heck's the turkey? Where's the stuffing? Where's the mashed potatoes? Where's the mac and cheese? Right? Very famously like shaming Snoopy because she's awful. And my son, who saw it last year, was so affected by it, he's like, what's up with Peppermint Patty? What's going on? Right? He didn't say exactly that, but he said something very similar. He was like, why is she being so mean? And so he decided, I want popcorn at Thanksgiving. So it's now going to become a tradition that every year we just have popcorn at Thanksgiving, right? Like, this is enough, right? Snoopy should have been thanked, but this is enough. Just this popcorn amongst the family will be enough, okay? Now you might say, okay, but that's just like a family tradition. And you're right, it's just a family tradition. But a tradition, properly speaking, is a handing on of an entire people. It's a handing on of an entire way of life. It's a school for an entire worldview. Oftentimes we don't think about that because we think the traditions are like really trivial, right? And it's as much for the individual as it is for the people who are watching. It's how you not just train a society, right? Because we're not lapdogs, but it's how we learn to love and commune with one another. Without those traditions, we don't have that opportunity. So we might think of saying something like this. Well, in America, whenever somebody has a birthday, what do? Sorry, Joseph, can you, yeah, there we go. What do? Yes, you celebrate, right? You might put up some balloons, you bake a cake. Yep, and then you sing, it's never on the right key, right? Everybody's always somewhere different, right? Yeah, you're around family, you might put you might put candles in the birthday cake. Why? Yeah, oftentimes you just say, oh, it's a tradition. Okay, good, now we're thinking, right? It's a tradition. But what are we saying? Very good. We're saying it is good that you exist. Think about that. We never say, has anyone ever said to the birthday boy, it is good that you exist? No, we don't. What we say is, happy birthday to you, right? And we sing the song, and we might add extra verses, right? Why do we use candles? Huh? So now we do, yeah, as a general case, we mark the years, right? So you put the number of candles generally, right? But why candles? Why couldn't I put like 13 grapes on it? Why candles? Why are we using candles though? What about the light? I think Pearl, right? Pearl. The light, what about the light? Yeah, very good. Okay. The reason you use candles is because candles, when there was no electricity, has always been a way to block out or to shun the darkness. So what are you saying when you put these candles on a kid's cake, on anybody's cake? What you're saying is your existence is so good It is a light to the darkness. And so we joyfully sing happy birthday. Before happy birthday, we sang for he's a jolly good fellow, right? Whatever song it is that you sing, maybe you do mañanitas in your family. Okay, fine, whatever. But the point is that what you're saying is, in this very small tradition, it is good that you exist. Thank the Lord that you're here for another year. But if I were to ask you, well, are birthday traditions important? You'd say, yeah, some of them are, some of them aren't, right? No. It's really important. These traditions bind us. And when you have kids watching, right, as their 90-year-old grandma receives this, they learn to delight in the goodness of their grandmother's existence. That's why we do it. It's a school, it's a way of communicating something really, really important. It's a handing on for the sake and the unity of the people. When God hands his Son over to us, it is to hand over a tradition. It is to hand over, right? When God hands his Son over to us, God gives us everything that we need to know, to love, to grow in grace. This is a kind of tradition. And he gives his entire self for the unity of the people in holiness. So the signs and symbols that the church gives us hand on what he handed on himself. That is what the signs and the symbols, the incense, the color, the stone, the architecture, all of these are handing on the faith of the apostles, the faith that our fathers handed on to us. So Catholic tradition in particular encompasses everything that Jesus handed on to us to believe. Now, why do I say it that way? Because you might hear there's some Christians who might say, well, I just need the Bible. Why do I need all of these Catholic traditions? And the response is because the first book of the New Testament wasn't even written for 30 years until after Jesus was born. So how did they know how to be Christian? By the traditions that were handed on by the apostles. Okay, well, but the Bible's written now, but there's a lot that's not in there. Let me give you an example. The Lord gave us his body and blood. This is in Scripture, right? John chapter 6, he says, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life within you. Those are his exact words. Okay, so we know we need to eat his flesh and drink his blood. We know that that's what we're receiving at Mass. It's not a symbol. It is his body, blood, soul, divinity. Does the Bible say how to do it? How would we know? Except by tradition. Except by the apostles taking us and saying, do you know how to recognize the Lord? Here, he hides in what looks like bread and wine. And isn't it so important that we should, wrap the church in color? Isn't that gift so important that we should cover it with incense so that we're not too close to the mystery? Isn't it so important that we should develop songs and ways to sing to the Lord, to praise him for that gift? That's what the apostles handed on. There's nothing in Scripture that says to me that I need to do X, Y, Z. It just says that at some point I got to eat. But the tradition, what the apostles handed on to us, was a way of recognizing and honoring that gift that could easily be lost. In other words, God forbid the Father's distributing communion, right? God forbid that he's distributing communion and all of a sudden a host falls on the ground and he forgets it because he doesn't see it. Would an average person who walks in and sees that host on the ground know that it's the Lord himself? The Lord who angels hide their face from because they cannot bear to look on how glorious he is? Would they know that in that what looks like bread and wine? They wouldn't. So what does the church do? What did the apostles do? They gave us signs and symbols to recognize what your average bear could not. That the Lord has come to meet me in signs and symbols that I may not even understand. That is what we mean by tradition, okay? And tradition, again, is not just my tradition. Tradition, G.K. Chesterton famously said, is a democracy of the dead. In other words, oftentimes we say, well, the dead don't have any choice. No. You better let them have a choice. Because some lessons take generations to know. It cannot be learned in a lifetime. You can only learn it in a tradition. You can only learn it if the dead have their say in the way that you live. I don't mean that like spiritually, like you're supposed to be using Ouija boards or something. What I mean by that is the lessons that your grandmother, great-grandmother, the things that they passed on that you may not understand are still worth doing. Why? Because there may be lessons that you cannot learn in a lifetime. Maybe over 2 lifetimes, the lesson became clear. And it's the same with the love of God. That God comes to meet me cannot be learned in the span of my lifetime. It takes 2,000 years of history of saints who struggle and die and spill their blood. It takes 2,000 years of tradition. So when I go to Mass, what I'm participating in, and I'm rounding third base, I promise. When I go to Mass, what I'm participating in is an unbroken ritual that shows what the apostles believed. So our fathers in faith have chosen symbols that communicate what's necessary for me to recognize that the Lord is near me, that the Lord loves me, that the Lord desires to heal me. There's nothing in Scripture that tells me that I should carve a crucifix and paint it and stare at it to contemplate the price of God's love for me. There's nothing in Scripture that says that. And yet, how less rich would our lives be if we never had any crucifixes in our homes? That is a tradition. That's an apostolic tradition, okay? So, Joseph, if you, I keep going. There we go. Okay. Let me give you some more examples just to kind of sweeten the pot here. There's nothing in Scripture that says an altar should be set apart on a raised platform. Take a look at the altar behind me, those of you that, right? There's nothing in Scripture that says it should be raised on a platform. Why do we do that? Why do we raise the altar on a platform? Why is it not on the same level as where I'm standing? So part of it is practical. Sure, yeah, absolutely. That's perfectly reasonable, yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. Absolutely right. Because the priest has to ascend. The priest ascends to God. Because the priest who carries all of our prayers, all of our hopes and fears, struggles, sins, that priest, we send him up the mountain. We send him to go up to meet God face to face. So we set the altar apart, right? We set it up above. Now, what happens if an altar is right here on the floor? Is the priest not ascending to God? No, he's still ascending to God. But by this sign, by this symbol, I know it. I can contemplate it, right? Similarly, there's nothing that says when I'm praying for forgiveness or preparing for Easter that I have to wear purple, right? So famously, Pope Benedict, right, had very beautiful vestments, these rich purples. Why do we wear purple? So that's part of it. That's a great reference. So she said because Jesus was robed in purple. That's true. That is the Gospel of John does say that. But the reason that purple is important is because it didn't really exist until the late 1800s. By which I mean it existed, but the only place that you could find it was in this tiny coast of Lebanon, where you had to smash thousands, hundreds of thousands of sea slugs. That was the only way that you could get purple. So only royalty could afford purple. You had to have buku bucks to afford that kind of color. It didn't really exist as a dye. So only kings could afford it. Why do we wear it in Lent? Why do we wear it in Advent? Because we are waiting for the king who comes to judge our souls. Luckily, the king is just, right? He loves us more than we could ever imagine, but we are waiting for the king. We wait in expectation. So the priest puts on purple to let you know he's coming. Okay, so the apostles give us, right? The church gives us these kinds of things. Every Mass is an opportunity to receive in my body the Lord who comes to meet me. And the truth is that because I can only come to know him by signs and symbols, he gives me an entire forest of symbols, some of which I may not understand. Think back to the column, right? The monks that are just incensing the column. They don't know why they're doing it. And yet, even as they don't know why they're doing it, They are receiving from their fathers something of importance. They're receiving what is important. There beneath that column, right, is St. John the Baptist who's praying for them. Even when I don't understand what's happening on the altar, there on that altar is the Lord coming to meet me. I may not understand, I may not recognize him perfectly, but that is the weight, that is the role of tradition. To say, even when I don't understand, this is what's happening. The Lord is coming to meet me. Okay, so here's the last thing. Joseph, if you would be so kind. Tradition cannot be done by a lecture. In other words, if you want to teach a child or any person how to be good, you have to make cookies with them. I mean that so sincerely. If you want to teach them how to be good, you don't give him lectures and say, little Timmy, this is what goodness is. This is how you be good. When this happens, then you can do this. Is that kid going to hear you? No. Most adults wouldn't hear you, okay? How do you teach someone to be good? You involve them in the traditions. In other words, you invite them into being good the same way that adults are. You give them hugs and kisses. You celebrate them and show them mercy when they do not deserve it. You teach them a happy birthday to celebrate other individuals just for the fact of existing. You make sure that he watches you admit fault and apologize to your spouse when you have been cruel. These are traditions that are to be handed on. The child doesn't learn because you told them. The child learns because you involve them in a tradition of being good. Joseph, if you could. So, similarly, you can't teach someone to be a good Catholic. I realize the irony is that I'm standing here trying to teach people how to be good Catholic, right? But you're not going to be good Catholics just because you heard me talk one day. That's not how it works. You let people smell the incense rising and hear the click of the incense when Father walks around the altar. You let them fall in love with that. You let them hear their family cry when the candlelight reflects off of the priest's black vestments because grandma just died. You let them throw rose petals joyfully before a statue of the Virgin Mary as she's processed on her feast day around the church. You laugh and complain with your neighbor because both of your stomachs are growling a little too loudly on Ash Wednesday. You let them radiate excitement when they hear the organ blare something triumphal just before the start of Mass. You let kids eat chocolate coins because St. Nicholas has left little chocolate coins in their shoes on his feast day, right? And you let them tremble. All of us, we should tremble before a crucifix when we look at the cost of our sin. Every Mass, the Lord uses these signs and symbols to help us realize that he's come to meet us, he's come to heal us, and that he's come to give us communion, the type of which Adam and Eve could have never imagined. So there's a real tendency to say, to treat the faith as though something that's like, oh, you're mature when you don't need these signs and symbols. No. The only mature person is the one who recognizes how immature they are. The wisest man in the room is the one who recognizes he's not very wise. And so if you want a mature faith, learn to love the signs and symbols. What do you do if you're at a parish and the priest says, we don't really need the incense today? What do? You insist, no, Father, that's how I see my prayers rising, right? You have to insist that he uses the incense. What do you do if Father just says, we're just going to put on this simple like Velcro vestment? That happens from time to time. What do? You say, no, Father, put on the nice one. Let the people see the glory of Jesus. Let them see his priesthood. Let him see that he's king. Put on the nice vestments, right? And insist to everybody that you know that the only mature Christian is one who believes that they are a child. Jesus says, let the children come to me. If you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, you have to be like a child. What do children need? They need the signs and the symbols. Whether we're talking about happy birthday or coming to Mass, they need the signs and the symbols. Now, 5 minutes over. That's actually pretty good timing. Here's what I'd like to do. Because it's important to me that you guys leave with some part of tradition or some aspect of tradition here that you can just do at home. Because that's the only way to be Catholic, is to just do the things at home. You come here certainly on a Sunday. But Mass is not just about what happens on Sunday, right? Mass is a preparation through the whole week. And because we have our organist here, Mr. Joseph Green, are you ready? Great. Here's what I want to do. He's going to speak to you about how to sing the Psalms. I bet you guys didn't think you were going to have to sing today, did you? You will. Okay, so he's going to teach us how to sing the Psalms. And the reason why is because this method can be applied to any time you see the Psalms. Anytime you're at home and you want to sing the Psalms, it doesn't matter. Once you learn this tone, you can apply it to any psalm, okay? I want you to be able to leave with that. Not just because it's good and I feel accomplished if you do, but because that's the first step of handing on a tradition to anybody who's in your home, is to learn how the church prays and then to teach it to somebody else, okay? So I'll come back. Joseph is going to take about maybe 10 minutes or so. And then after that, I'll stay here for any questions, okay? Sound good? Joseph? Huh? Yeah, they're right here. Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Cool.
All right, so we're gonna pass out some of these sheets here, which have it too. So you can also take these home and bring them to your family and sing this. So it's Psalm 23. And you guys might have heard us use the psalm tones a little bit already, actually, because in the antiphons, which we have in all of our missals, these psalm tones are what we're using. Maybe you hear da-da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-dum, that kind of thing, which we do at the beginning of communion, right after the procession. All of these are what we call the Gregorian tones. And they're just very simple ways of musically packaging a psalm or a text from the Bible. So today what we're going to do, we're going to learn the Gregorian tone number 8. And anytime you see that little 8 in your missal, you can know that it should sound a little bit like this, right? So it goes, and if you see there in the music, the oval with the squares on it, with the lines around it, that's what we call the reciting tone. So most of the psalm is just going to be sung on that tone. And then you have your little ending, which gives it a little bit of a flourish at the end of each line. Most of the time you're going to alternate between 2 lines. And every once in a while you'll have a 3rd line. And when you have that little cross, that's what we call the flex. And that just ends a little bit differently, but it's actually quite easy. So if you just see these 2 lines, let's sing them all together. So it goes, la, 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 la. Can we sing that together on laws? La, 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 la. All right? And so the flex is a little bit different. On the flex, you just go down at the very end. So la, la, and that's it. So when you get the flex, it's quite simple, but just watch out. You see the little cross symbol at the end of some of these lines. Ruben, could you go up so you can change the slide when it gets to it? So the other thing is those first 2 notes, the da-da-dum, we only do those for the very first one. So after the first one, we're just going to stay on the reciting tone at the start of each song. Okay? Why don't we let's all sing together the start of this psalm here. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. You kind of see how that goes, right? It's going to repeat that basic formula throughout. Let's do it one more time, and then we're going to keep going. Just watch out for the flexes there. The cool thing is, once you have this down, you can go to any psalm you want, Psalm 27, whatever your favorite psalm is, and you can just kind of mark in those little underlines. That's what we call pointing a psalm. You can just mark it in so that it feels natural. You usually look for like the last accent or the last 2 accents. And that'll allow you to be able to sing any psalm you like just with this little formula here. If you've ever been to an abbey or a monastery, you might hear them do this when they pray their liturgy the hours together. So let's do it all together from the beginning now. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. Flex. For thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. We'll end with the Gloria, and usually we bow as we do the Gloria. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. Amen. So yeah, that's just a little bit of an intro on how to do psalm tones. Hopefully you'll start to recognize these two as we do them in Mass, but you can also take these home, sing them with your children, sing them with your families, with your friends. It's a very beautiful way to, sometimes we read scriptures, and because we're so feeble, you can be like, okay, right? But this gives just that little bit of extra delight, which can help us to persevere in the meditation on scriptures. So yeah, thank you all very much. Thank you, Ruben, for a great talk. And I think we'll take some questions now.
You'll have to excuse me for being out of breath. I ran from the organ. Okay, does anybody have any questions? Yes, ma'am. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm. Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. So that's a great question. Let me repeat it because I think there are some people who are live streaming who, because you didn't have the mic, that's not your fault, that's our fault. Because you didn't have the mic, they might not have heard it on live stream. So the question was, with all this talk of tradition and that extending to art, to architecture in particular, right? The question was about architecture. That she's noticing in the past maybe 30 or so years that whatever principles that we're using to build churches like this one, this is a very beautiful church here, for whatever reason, they're not the same principles from which we're building churches today. In other words, you're seeing more rounded churches. You're seeing, altars closer towards the center and things like that. And the commentary was that you find it more pleasing to come to a church like this or a church that's built a little bit more traditionally because, it just feels more traditional, right? So let me affirm you that you're not crazy and that is what is happening. The idea is, let me be careful in the way that I'm saying this. The church doesn't technically have one style of architecture, right? There is no like church style or Catholic church style of architecture. And what I mean by that is there are certain principles that have to be met when you're building a church. But that's to say that you can have like a Romanesque church, you can have like a Spanish mission church, which is kind of what this is. This is a kind of a mix between Spanish mission and Gothic. You can have a basilica, you can have all kinds of forms of churches. The question really isn't whether or not we're using this style or that style. What you've rightly put your finger on is this question. Whatever decisions went into the building of this or that church, were they the same ideas? Were they the same notions that our fathers, the apostles, the saints, are they built by the same notions? And I think you're putting your finger on something that's kind of, that a lot of people are noticing, but maybe not saying. And that is, in a lot of places, when you're building a new Catholic church, we're not really using the same principles to build Catholic churches that we did, say, maybe 50 or 60 years ago. Now, thankfully, there's been, I think, a rediscovery of some of the traditional kind of ways of building churches, the kind of traditional ways of doing things. And I strongly encourage that because it's almost like, it's like a flash, right? Like you walk into a traditional church or a church that's really beautiful, and you don't have to wonder whether, Jesus is here, whether the church believes that Jesus is present. But then there are some churches you walk into and they look like a spaceship, and you're like, what? Where is Jesus, right? And sometimes Jesus will be like in the tabernacle in a corner somewhere, not prominent in any way, shape, or form. So I don't know that I have much commentary other than to encourage us all to pray that at some point we recover the same principles that built churches like this. This church was built, I think, in the late 1920s, and then consecrated in the very, very early 30s. And it's so evident. It has good bones, right? Like that you can see in the rafters. Right? There's a lot of work to be done, certainly. But you can just see, like, as you look up in the rafters, as you look at the beautiful marble altar, there are good bones here, right? So the principles that we receive from our fathers were definitely in use, whereas there are some churches that just, for whatever reason, we don't. The challenge, I think, is to take those churches, those spaceship churches, and to turn them into something that is recognizable, to turn them into something that is beautiful, to turn them into something where you do immediately recognize the Lord is present, and not just that, but the people believe the Lord is present. But I want to affirm you in what you're seeing. You're not crazy. That is exactly what's happening. Any other questions, comments? Yes, sir.
So this Sunday, I went to a Byzantine Orthodox church, Catholic, and I noticed that they have an iconostasis.
Iconostasis.
Yeah. And I'd like you to explain that a little bit.
Yeah, so an iconostasis, when you go into a Byzantine Catholic church, so there's several ways of doing Mass, would be the easy way to explain it. But when you walk into a Byzantine church, like, so say this altar here would be behind an entire wall of saints. Like, there's just images of saints. So in other words, you can't even really see what the priest is doing. That's how sacred, they hold it. Right, that when you walk into, like, only the priest is allowed to walk in, and in fact, the only time you see the altar is when they do liturgies. They have to open up a curtain that lets you see into the hole, and then the deacon comes, like, in and out of this wall of saints. And the reason that they do that is because there's supposed to be a distinction between heaven and earth, right? So there's a distinction between heaven and earth. Christ is doing something in heaven, and then he's bringing communion to the people in earth. So that's what the wall symbolizes. We used to have, very often, that exact thing. Does anybody know how we did that? So the Byzantines have a whole wall. Roman Catholics, we used to have what? Altar rails. Yeah, so altar rails. That was the function of the altar rail, right? Was to separate what's happening in heaven versus what's happening in earth. So in a traditional church, when you see the altar rail, what's happening is, just like we said before, the priest ascends into heaven, right? And then is given these divine mysteries. What he receives, right, meaning the bread and wine become Jesus' body and blood, he turns around and across the altar rail now gives it to you on earth. That's the kind of symbolism that's happening in the altar rail. Yeah. So it's just two ways of using the same thing. Now we don't normally have altar rails. Most churches are not built with altar rails. Again, for one reason or another. There's lots of reasons for that. But the way that we normally symbolize that is to at least have the altar like raised on a platform away from the floor. That's the way we normally do that. Sorry, was there a question, or was it just? Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Great. Yes, ma'am. Oh, sorry. I think Joseph's going to bring you the microphone for the people.
Making him get his workout today.
Yeah.
Okay. I just had a question in regards to Pope, who is it? Pope Leo the 13th.
Yeah.
In regards to saying the Saint Michael the Archangel prayer. How come some churches have gotten away from doing that? Because that was, I believe, to, so we can leave church, say the prayer so that we can have that protection. So why did that tradition leave?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So one way to explain it is there's a difference between, so when you look at the missal, so you guys might notice that there's a big red book that the priest uses for Mass. That's like his script, amongst a lot of other things. That tells him what he's supposed to be doing. The old missal in 1962, this was 2 missals ago actually, the old missal in 1962 required that the St. Michael prayer be done. It had to be said as a part of the ending of Mass, right? Now, after the 70s, that prayer was taken out. For what reason, I couldn't say. That prayer was taken out. So the question is, okay, well, it's a tradition, right? So this is the exact kind of thing that we're talking about. It is a strong Catholic tradition that at the end of Mass, you say the St. Michael prayer, right? That's a tradition. The difference is, right now, it's not a rule anymore. So there are some parishes that you might go to, and the priest might not say it, but the congregation will say the St. Michael prayer as the priest is walking out, maybe after he's walked out, after the Mass is technically ended, because again, it's not formally a part of the Mass anymore. There are some places where it's completely banned to say it anywhere near the Mass. I think that's not probably wise, but that's the explanation for the shifting tradition, right? That in one instance, Rome in the Pope said, yep, you have to say it. After a certain time, then Rome reversed it and said, you can say it, you can keep doing it, but it's not a necessary thing. Now, if you want your priests to start saying it, right, or if you want the people to start saying it or for it to become a tradition in your parish, I think that's something you just got to talk to Father about, right? Most priests will be open to at least hearing what the suggestion is. You may not get everything that you want, but certainly that would be a great tradition to revive, right? To ask St. Michael, who's the terror of demons, to protect us at the end of Mass. What a great tradition, But anyway, so the question was about the change. Rome has the authority to tell us what to do, and that means at one point they told us to do it, at another point they told us not to, and so we are obedient to Rome, right? That's what we do. That's what we are as Roman Catholics. But that's a great question. Okay, we'll do one more, and then I'll answer the one more, and then after that, I'll stay for questions. I'm not going to leave, but I don't want to hold everybody until every last question is done. Okay? Yes, sir.
So I have a question regarding your discussion on how we're made in the image of God. Mm-hmm. You were saying that we're made in the image of God because of our rationality, right?
Rationality and love. Ability to know and to love rationally is the way I said it.
To know and to love rationally.
Correct.
I guess my question is, could you sort of elaborate on what you mean by that? Because you used an example of we love our children even when they're being annoying to us, and even when they're sometimes being a pain in the neck.
Sure.
But isn't it true that mammals also treat their children like that because their very survival depends on it? And
yeah.
In another aspect, you said to know rationally. Several other animals are very capable, obviously not to the level of human intellect, but they are very capable of understanding, right? Like crows and chimps and things like that. So I guess my question is why is human rationality so, why do we consider that to be made in the image of God?
Yeah.
Instead of saying
That's
all creation is made in the image of God, but we are the closest to his image.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Super softball. So one way to think about it is this. The thing that distinguishes, what's the easiest way to explain it? The thing that distinguishes human rationality is that we can discern according to concepts that are invisible. In other words, they really do exist, but they're invisible, right? They're not bound by space and time. One example might be something like this. Nobody yelled the answer out. I'm thinking of a cat. I'm thinking of a cat who hates Mondays. He eats lots of lasagna. He has This might be a dated reference, but he has a dog. He has a dog friend named Odie. Does everybody know what I'm talking about here? Please don't say it out loud. But I want to give this example. Sir, do you know what I'm talking about here? Okay, all right. If I ask you, how much does that idea weigh? You have the idea, right? In your mind. It's real. It's a real idea. It's a real idea. Okay, good. How much does it weigh? Right? What does it smell like? What color is it? Right? Do you see the difficulty we're having here? You have a knowledge of a thing that has a kind of existence that is real, but is not bound by space and time. In other words, it's a non-material reality. That's really the fundamental distinction. When a dog knows this or that, he knows the bowl is here, he knows, yes, this is my human, I like this human because they give me pets on the head. They're not really discerning, I ought to do this or I ought to do this. It's good to do this or it's bad to do this according to the principles that are invisible. In other words, the principles of logic or the principles of thinking. Does that make sense? So the key distinction here between human beings thinking or thinking about anything is going to be that we discern according to both physical and non-physical principles. So you might say something like this: what does it mean to be good, right? Or what's the first principle of being good? The first principle might be something like, I should be good, I should do good and avoid evil. That's a very classic principle, right? I should do good and I should avoid evil. You can only really object to that, but you can't really object to that, right? Because what if you say something like this? Well, I don't think that's true. Well, then what have you just done? You've now redefined good and evil. Does that make sense? So because human beings are the only kind of thing that are physical, right? Angels can do this kind of thing, but since human beings are the only kind of thing that are capable of doing that, and reasoning according to invisible principles or principles of non-contradiction and things like that, that's going to be the distinguishing factor. So take a step back. I say, what distinguishes us is we are made in the image and likeness of God, and I say, image is to know and to love rationally. When my son, the reason I use my son crying in my ear, right, is because what I'm recognizing is an eternal principle that goes beyond what I'm feeling in a particular moment. Right? Now, a mom monkey might say, this baby monkey is annoying, right? And then just might try to shut the baby up. But the mom doesn't reason according to principles. It is good that you exist, right? She doesn't, the mommy gorilla doesn't say to the baby gorilla, it is good that you exist, because goodness is an invisible reality. Does that make sense? So there's a kind of distinction in our thinking that's so radically different from the kind of things that the animals do, even if sometimes they look similar. I might say, the objection I get sometimes is like, okay, but animals don't love rationally, and then somebody will show me a video of a dog on the news who like saved his master, dragging him across, and they say, see, he loves, and it's like, okay, yes, does he love? Yeah, I grant that. But he doesn't love according to the principles that a human being would love, right? A dog loves because the master's good. A dog loves because the master feeds him. A dog loves because this or that. I should love even when a person is cruel. I should love even when someone is foul. I should love, right? So these are invisible principles that guide my reasoning that an animal is not going to have access to. Does that answer the question? Okay, great. Okay, I will take everything else off the air. Guys, thank you so much for being here. I hope that it was at least valuable on some level. But really, come back. Joseph is going to do the next talk. He'll be here in July. Hopefully, I won't be because I'll be on paternity leave. But Joseph will be here. You'll be in good hands. So thank you guys again for being here. All right.